Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Uganic Lake on the northern side of Kodiak Island, Alaska. This lake is only 3 miles from our episode regarding the 5 brown bears that attacked Michael Snowden and Jeff Ostrin we covered a little while ago. The giant bears of Kodiak Island can clearly be aggressive toward people and are known for their size and demeanor. Uganic Lake is located at around 76 feet in elevation and is covered in a dense mat of alder and grasses. The land is sloping up toward the middle of the island, but still low in elevation even at the peaks. Uganic River enters the lake at the south and flows toward the north and enters Uganic Bay opposite Sally Island. These water bodies teem with salmon in parts of the summer, drawing brown bears for miles from the surrounding area. On Kodiak Island, Sitka black-tailed deer are plentiful and wary, making them a great source of game for hunters. According to biologists, the deer are not native to this area, but migrated up as glaciers retreated about 8,100 years ago. They subsist by browsing on plant stems and grasses and easily swim to nearby islands whenever they need to. Deer and bears have been hunted by humans here for eons, and traditionally, indigenous hunters would leave the heads of bears behind as a spiritual tribute to the animals. They would use most other parts of the bears. This relationship has existed in a delicate balance that leads all species to sustain their existence in an interdependent cycle of predators and prey. On Friday, November 3rd of 1988, this cycle was spinning another revolution as 38-year-old Dwayne Christensen and Bill Burgess stalked blacktails while trying to avoid the brown bears that were doing the same thing for the same reasons. Christensen lived in Fairbanks and was an avid outdoorsman. Their hunting trip had been uneventful to this point, at least as uneventful as hunting on the giant bear's turf can be. Burgess was the first of the hunters to find success and shot a deer that the men had soon found dead in the grass. He quickly cut the animal open and began to pull the entrails from its carcass. The scent of fresh blood and body fluids from the deer wafted onto the breeze. Typically, as one hunter guts the deer, the other stands guard over his partner. The bears on Kodiak Island are known for their keen sense of smell and aggressive approach to claiming gut piles and even carcasses from hunters. They've been known to listen for the report of hunting rifles and converge on the area in search of deer meat, frequently causing altercations with hunters. Burgess began processing the deer by removing its organs to help preserve the meat from rot. As discussed previously, this involves at least one of the hunters focusing on cutting the deer open from its ribcage to its lower abdomen. As you can imagine, this creates an environment filled with the scent of blood and deer body fluids that the big bears find nearly irresistible. As Christensen stood watch over his hunting partner, Burgess quickly pulled the entrails from the deer he had harvested. The men knew that they wanted to be as far away from the remains as possible if any bears did appear, to claim whatever was left over. Some hunters can gut a deer in about 6 minutes, and even this is too slow to escape the brown bears on occasion. Christensen decided that he could see better from the top of the hill and started to climb his way through the brush. Along his way, he saw a deer that was within reach of his rifle. He quickly shot the buck and watched it dash into the brush, leaving a blood trail through the grass for a few hundred yards. As he followed the blood trail, he could see the drops in big splotches along the deer's path. At about 100 yards down the blood trail, he could see the body of the deer, lying dead in the grass. Now all he had to do was gut the deer, and the 2 hunters could drag their carcasses back to camp. Christensen unsheathed his knife and bent over the deer as he positioned himself to gut it. Suddenly a low, rumbling growl sent a shiver down his spine. He stood to his full height and saw a huge sow brown bear and 2 cubs beside her, only 15 yards away. The 3 bears were straddling the buck's blood trail and had followed it right to Christensen's location. As soon as they locked eyes, the sow dug her paws into the soil as she started her initial leap toward him. Christensen raised his hands above his head and yelled at the bear, but she didn't slow down. The brush popped and bowed as she plowed her way through it in a straight line toward him. He knew he had no choice but to defend himself. He raised his rifle and quickly fired a deafening shot at her head. His aim was true enough, as his bullet struck the sow directly through her eye, but she didn't miss a step. Before he could work the action on his rifle to load the next round, the sow had closed in on him. The bear swatted him and sent him flying backward and onto his back. Somehow Christensen maintained his grip on his hunting rifle, but had no chance to fire a second round before the bear knocked him down. Christensen yelled and scrambled around, trying to regain his feet. The sow didn't hesitate in her unrelenting attack on him. She plowed into him again and flattened him with his face in the grass. Now at the mercy and whim of the sow, each painful bite caused Christensen to jerk and scream in reaction. He lost his grip on his hunting rifle during the attack and could only stare into the eyes of the hungry and now wounded bear only a few feet from him. By now Burgess had heard the bear's roar and his partner's screams. He covered the short distance as quickly as he could to a point where he could see Christensen and the bears. He briefly watched as the bear and his hunting partner tumbled around and moved himself into a better position for a shot. Burgess knew he could easily wound his partner while attempting to save his life, so lining himself up for a safe shot at the bear was critical. He watched as the bear repeatedly bit Christensen in the thighs and buttocks. Enormous wounds were opened up in his hunting partner's body as Burgess's ears filled with Christensen's screams. Burgess lifted his deer hunting rifle, and as the sow stood to her hind feet, he fired a second shot into the bear. His bullet struck home and took the fight out of the bear. She slumped over and tossed her head in the uncoordinated throes of death. Christensen now lay on the ground with the bear right next to him. He could see the bear was much larger than he was, and was in awe of its muscular and powerful build. The bear measured just over 8 feet tall and weighed in at 750 pounds. Her 2 cubs from the previous year wandered around the area, but didn't demonstrate any aggression towards the men. Now severely wounded, Christensen was facing a bleak situation. The attack happened on Friday, and they had arrangements to be picked up on Saturday. That meant that he would have to wait for a day for rescue and medical attention if they couldn't figure out how to get help before that. Once arrangements were made, he was flown to a medical center in the town of Kodiak before being transferred to Fairbanks for advanced treatment for his wounds. The sow was killed during the attack, and her cubs were not. The hunters indicated that the cubs stayed in the area and fed upon the deer carcass for a day or so before wandering off the next day. Their whereabouts were not known after Christensen was rescued, and there is no indication of efforts to locate them, or if those efforts were successful. Just a day before this attack, a man named Harley Sievenpiper was killed and partially eaten by a brown bear on Baranof Island, a few hundred miles to the south. He was deer hunting as well, and was using a deer call, which was believed to be the cause of his attack. This episode is linked to in the video article below this video, so reviewing it and comparing the attacks will be easy for you if you're interested in doing so. The similarities are eerie and show you just how badly Christensen's attack could have ended if it wasn't for Burgess. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. What similarities do you see between the fatal bear attack on Sievenpiper and Christensen's mauling? Can deer hunters do anything to avoid being attacked by hungry brown bears? Was it easier for indigenous hunters to harvest deer given they didn't ring the dinner bell by using firearms? Or would the wounded animal's blood trail still bring in bears? What would go through your mind if you glanced up to see 3 huge Kodiak brown bears only 15 yards away from you as you stood over a bleeding deer? I will be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us back to Hidden Creek Trail near Uganic Lake on the Kenai Peninsula in South Alaska. In previous episodes on this channel, I've discussed how the Sitka spruce stands intermingle with alder patches to cover the sloping topography and low elevation of this area. The creeks and streams here run briskly with salmon during parts of the summer. This activity is key to bear survival and brings people into proximity with bears. Although there are plentiful moose on the peninsula for the bears to eat, the salmon provide a nearly irreplaceable source of fat and nutrients to the bears. A resource that the bears will defend from each other violently, and sometimes to the death. Early summer is a great time for bears in Alaska. Only a few weeks before this time of year, bears emerge from their winter dens, hungry and searching for food. Initially, they feed on plant matter, like sedge grasses and plant buds. From time to time, they may catch a moose calf, or even find an injured moose to feed upon, but the most plentiful food source for them is when the salmon begin to run in the creeks and streams. Around May each year, the first ocean-bound fish that start making their way upstream are known as candlefish, or scientifically, ulicons. These pencil-long fish are up to 20% fat and are among the first fish to run up freshwater streams. These little fish are not only an important source of fat for sea lions, seals, whales, sharks, salmon, and seabirds, they also feed bears, wolves, and eagles on their migration inland. Once they lay their eggs in the silty waters of streams and creeks, their bodies perish and provide food for scavengers and an aromatic signal to bears that fish are migrating upstream. This scent draws bears from their winter dens in higher elevations toward the streams and creeks in preparation for the salmon runs that take place over the summer. If bears fail to capitalize on the various fish runs along the streams, then they may be in for a bleak and desperate winter. At 11:45 a.m. on Thursday, November 16, 2023, a 72-year-old fisherman, whom we will call Dan, was fishing with one of his buddies, whom we will call Chad, along Hidden Creek near Uganic Lake. As any sportsman would agree, a day at the lake is better than any day in the office, and trout fishing at Uganic Lake was proof of that axiom. As Dan and his partner pushed their way through the thick alders along the banks of the creek, they worked their way toward the lake. They'd hoped to land a big lake trout, rainbow, or Dolly Varden, but then again, it wouldn't be called fishing if the results were guaranteed. Besides, it wasn't how big the fish was, but how big the story was. Well, today's fishing story was about to take a fascinating twist. Now, Dan was no dummy when he ventured into the forest to fish. He brought along with him his bear spray, even though bears should be hibernating by this time of year. A familiarity with the risks of venturing into the forests of Alaska made him prepare, at least as much as he thought he should. As the men went from fishing hole to fishing hole, they had varying luck and could see the last remnants of the prior season's salmon run. Salmon carcasses littered the banks in pockets, rotting and signaling the end of the season. The fish were more isolated since the snowmelt had long subsided, and this variation provided pockets of success or frustration, depending on the fish. As Dan pushed his way from one of the fishing holes to another, he approached a desperate and dire standoff with a protective mama brown bear, and was completely oblivious to what lay ahead of him. With the leaves now fallen and the air turned more crisp by the brief fall, Dan didn't expect to be as alert for the location of bears. During prior months, bears would crowd the banks of Hidden Creek and most other bodies of water, but now most of them were denned up, or heading there. Chad and Dan were parting the brush and weaving their fishing poles through the tangled brush when a flash of brown blurred through the bushes toward their left and ahead of them. They could recognize this bouncing ball of fuzz as a brown bear cub, but that begged the question, where was its mother? Before the fishermen could do anything about it, the sow they were hoping to locate made her location well known. With a roar that nearly split their eardrums, the sow emerged from a location just behind where the cub had dashed from to their right. The sow focused her eyes on the fisherman, and primarily on Dan, given he was closer to her cub. In a flash, the sow closed the distance between her and Dan. She quickly swatted the man and bit him several times in a rapid and severe attack. She knocked Dan down and swatted him a few more times before disappearing into the brush to find her cubs. Chad somehow had avoided being attacked by the angry sow and stood afterward, confused and overwhelmed at the speed and violence of the sow's attack on Dan. Seeing his friend laying on the ground, bleeding and stunned, triggered something in Chad. He knew he would have to find help for Dan. Given the men had few options but to walk out, he helped Dan to his feet, and they assessed the damage inflicted by the bear. There isn't a clear source that indicates just how the men managed to get help, but somehow a medevac helicopter made its way to their location. The first responders loaded Dan into the helicopter and quickly flew him out to a hospital for medical attention. Once he was examined, Dan's injuries were labeled as non-life-threatening, which is no indication of their severity. To be categorized as life-threatening, an injury must cause loss of consciousness, impaired cognition, substantial blood loss, head trauma, or breathing problems. That would limit Dan's injuries to non-arterial bleeding, located anywhere but his head or neck. I would say he got out lucky, given he had walked between a brown bear sow and her cub. In response to Dan's attack, authorities closed the Hidden Creek Trail to all visitors. They'd conducted a quick investigation into the attack and had vacated the area no later than 6 p.m. the following Thursday. This was done to allow the sow and her cubs time to calm down from the stressful altercation they'd had with Dan and his partner, and to prevent further confrontations with her. Hidden Creek has been the location of another interesting episode on our channel, and this one indicates a dire trend in brown bear tolerance of human presence in the area. Our prior episode is linked to in the video article below this video, so you can review it if you are interested in learning about it. Authorities cite the backcountry traffic substantially increased following the COVID-19 lockdowns. With an increase in human traffic, starving or hungry bears may be falling back on aggressive and defensive behavior to protect food sources. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Granted that Dan and Chad had brought bear spray, would a firearm have changed the outcome of this attack? Did this sow's cubs see anything that may increase the likelihood of them attacking humans over their lives? What could Dan and Chad have done to avoid such a violent surprise confrontation? What would you do if you found yourself face to face with an angry brown bear sow, armed only with a fishing pole for your defense? I'll be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Von Postbreen Glacier just northeast of the town of Longyearbyen on Svalbard Island, Norway. Access to this area is gained by boat or plane by following the Icefjord Inlet and hanging a right at the Sassenfjord Arm. At the end of the arm is the boundary of the Sassenbundsø Land National Park. The park and its glaciers descend from the slopes of Hampesfjellet Mountain and decline toward the sea. This area is lower elevation, with the highest peak being Mount Newtontoppen, rising 5,620 feet above sea level. Small plants, lichens, mosses, and fungi make up the fauna on this island, as there are no tall trees. Caribou are just about the only land animals you'll see, apart from Arctic foxes and polar bears. The first week of August 2011 was an exciting one for the young members of the expedition organized by the British School Exploring Society. This organization planned and administered trips to ecologically sensitive areas to increase awareness amongst its members. The expeditions were expensive, but explorers and their families recognized the value was worth the cost. Being that they were charged a premium for the expeditions, parents and explorers had realistic expectations of safety for the participants. After arriving at the campsite, the explorers and their chaperones set up tents and rolled out bedrolls, with the youngsters sharing tents and the elders having their own. Their tents were arranged in a large circle, with their access flaps pointed toward one another. As a precaution, the expedition was provided with an electric alarm fence, which was designed to keep polar bears from invading the perimeter of the camp without the occupants being alerted. This fence had been on several trips and packed for storage between them. The wear and tear on the materials in the fence had already taken a toll, but it still functioned, with a few small improvisations. The camp hosts also brought along a vintage Mauser 98K Army rifle from World War II stock. It was fairly reliable and had seen its better days, but would be thought of as a backup source of protection to the fence. Now, many expeditions are required to establish a bear watch to make sure that polar bears do not sneak into camp while everyone is sleeping. As we discussed in our prior episode, catching Arctic campers in their tents is easy for a stealthy and camouflaged polar bear to accomplish and is the worst-case scenario. During a typical bear watch, a volunteer stands guard with flashlights or spotlights to ensure the camp perimeter is safe while other campers sleep. After a designated time, that volunteer is relieved by a different volunteer, and so on until the sun is up. Having experience performing bear watches on prior expeditions, some chaperones were concerned about exhausting the explorers and decided against establishing one. The best-case scenario for a bear watch is that the volunteer stays alert for their shift, but the inherent flaws in that assumption reveal the weakness of the execution of a bear watch. Each day the explorers were tasked with a specific goal which varied between completing a hike, collecting information, or cooperating on a task. A few days prior, while out and about, the explorers had happened upon a polar bear track in the snow. The track was eerily just outside their camp a few hundred yards. After discussing the presence of the bear tracks near their camp, the chaperones pointed out that the precautions they had taken would be sufficient protection. Given their long and safe history of expeditions in the Arctic, polar bears are not as big a threat as they seem. After all, venturing into the bear's environment creates an expectation and possibility of seeing them in their natural habitat and function. That night, the explorers were tired from the day's activities and settled into their warm sleeping bags to rest. In a tent shared by Patrick Flinders, Horatio Chappell, and Scott Bennell Smith, Flinders rolled his sleeping bag out in the middle, with Chappell and Bennell Smith on each side of him. After a small amount of bedtime banter, the boys drifted off to sleep. After several hours of peaceful sleep, Patrick was awoken by the violent shaking of their tent. He heard odd scratching sounds on the tent fabric. As he looked around, he could see the tent bow downward toward his face and then collapse. The young man immediately pulled his sleeping bag up over his head and curled into a ball. He was hoping this was only a nightmare and screamed, "I don't want to be here anymore," repeatedly. The top of his tent was torn away, allowing a flood of cold morning air and light to permeate the inside. Patrick could hear yelling outside his sleeping bag as the chaperones were trying to run the polar bear off. He glanced outside his sleeping bag and could see one of them being dragged across the ground by his head in the polar bear's jaws. He shuddered at the sight of such a scene, and terror filled him as the polar bear's head swung in the direction of his tent once again. Patrick tried to pull himself deeper into his sleeping bag, but its paltry shelter would only protect him from the cold temperatures. He peeked out once again from his sleeping bag to see the enormous head of a polar bear snapping its jaws at anything inside his tent. The fur of its face was covered in blood from the chaperone it had attacked. By this point, Patrick was convinced that he might die. Despite his attempts at concealing himself in his sleeping bag, the bear had focused in on him. The massive polar bear struck the sleeping bag that concealed Patrick, which knocked him sideways. In the shift of his position, his arm poked out of his sleeping bag. The polar bear didn't miss a detail, or an opportunity. As soon as it saw Patrick's arm protruding from his sleeping bag, it bit into the boy's elbow, crushing his bones. The pain was terrible, but the cracking of his bones meant that his injuries were far more serious than a gash or puncture. As Patrick squirmed away from the bear, it had somehow locked its jaws around his face. With his ears so close to the bear's mouth, its growl seemed overwhelmingly loud. The boy's facial bones cracked under the destructive power of the bear's bite. Without anything for his defense, Patrick resorted to using his fists. He repeatedly punched at the bear and flailed his arms, trying to strike any vulnerable part of the bear. It was then that Scott Bennell Smith bolted from the boy's tent. This immediately drew the bear's attention, and it dashed toward him. Only a few strides into its pursuit of Scott, Patrick heard his friend cry out, followed by the thunderous report of a rifle bellowing from nearby. One of the expedition's chaperones, Michael Reed, had been attempting to shoot the polar bear, but the rifle wouldn't fire on the previous 4 attempts. By the time it fired, the bear had mauled several people and killed Horatio Chappell. The bullet finally brought the bear's violence to an end, but the cost was horrendous to the survivors and the dead. The total damage done by the polar bear was the camp guide, Michael Reed, with a severe bite wound to his head, Scott Bennell Smith with paw swipes to his head and back, Patrick Flinders with a gashed and cracked skull from the bear's bite, Andrew Ruck with a clawed face, and Horatio Chappell dead. Yet this attack could have been worse. After the polar bear was dispatched, its corpse was examined by investigators. It was found to be a 24-year-old male with broken and infected teeth. It was severely underweight at only 550 pounds. This episode is a follow-up to the prior episode regarding Horatio Chappell's death, which is linked below. It is written from the perspective of Patrick Flinders and what he witnessed and experienced during the event. After reviewing the details of this attack, I'm left with a few questions for you. Given the expedition's bear fence was modified, was the British School Exploring Society negligent in their actions taken to prevent a polar bear attack? Was the risk of exhaustion worth establishing a bear watch the night of the attack? How did the polar bear know to knock over the fence post to render it useless? I will enjoy reading and replying to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.